Good afternoon, everybody. I am Zohran Mamdani, the Executive Director of SPME and ESMEA, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you to our webinar series show. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to our friend, David Kaufman. David is the opinion editor for the New York Post. He is a prolific writer and researcher who's been focusing on politics and business and culture in the New York area and beyond. He has been dealing of late with a lot of issues regarding anti-Semitism around the world and in New York particularly. And of course, he's been tracking the Mamdani race and its consequences within New York. And this afternoon, he's going to discuss and unpack all of that for us culturally, politically, and what this all means for New York going forward. And I think what it also means for America as far as the larger topics that many of us have been discussing for years and weeks now regarding the normalization of anti-Semitism post 10/7 and prior to that. So format-wise, David will talk for about 25 minutes or so, then we'll go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat, so all you have to do for those of you who are regulars is type in your questions via the chat, and we will do our best to get to all of them in a timely fashion. If we don't, we apologize in advance. And then we will take it from there. So, David, welcome to the show, and
Thank you.
Virtual floor is now yours.
Yeah, so I'm David Kaufman. I edit our Sunday ideas and opinions section at the New York Post called Postscript. I've been doing that for 3.5 years. Actually, this week will be my last week doing that. Friday will be my last section. Coincidentally enough, next week I start at the Mayor Adams campaign. I'm going to be coming on to the Mayor Adams campaign as a media advisor to get the mayor reelected and to kick Mamdani's butt. So that's what I can report for the moment. So, we're here to talk about, the mayoral race that's happening in New York City. It's a race that took everybody sort of by surprise a couple of weeks ago. Mamdani had this, very, very impressive, very clear win. He beat Cuomo. He beat, the son of one of the most important, if not the most important political families in New York history or recent New York history. And he also beat, a man who had triple the funding that he had. He beat a man who everybody thought was unbeatable. But, for me, it wasn't particularly surprising that Mamdani won. On one level, Cuomo had really kind of been a bit of asleep at the wheel. At the New York Post, we had an opinion piece a couple of weeks ago where we literally said, where the hell is this guy? Where's Cuomo? Because he was campaigning so lackadaisically and lacklusterly. And Mamdani was out there. I mean, say what you want about this guy, this kid, this 33-year-old, democratic socialist, is Ugandan born, Gujarati Muslim Indian, the son of a very famous filmmaker and a radical professor from Columbia, a young man who apparently thinks that he's African-American because he posted African-American on his Columbia admission application. Even though I think all of us out there don't think he's African-American. So, how did this happen? And I think a lot of it happened for a few reasons. In Mamdani's defense, he ran a really good campaign, while Cuomo was busy being, where is he? Mamdani was literally walking the entirety of Manhattan, shaking hands and meeting voters and really kind of, glad-handing the folks who came out to support him. He also just ran a very, very appealing campaign. He is sort of like the embodiment of this kind of progressive liberal spirit that's taken over the United States, and particularly, progressive big cities like New York. He's young, he's sort of, multi-culti and he's nice looking, and he has, an interesting background. He hasn't only had a job, but he was a rapper. And he went to a good college. So he likes to take the subway. He eats, multi-ethnic food. He's everything, on an interesting level. Mamdani is everything that we are celebrating about for America. He is this sort of immigrant success story in some ways, but it's sort of the success story gone wrong. What's really concerning to me, there's so many things that are concerning about Mamdani. Now that we've given him his props that he ran a good campaign, well done. The question is, what is this campaign about? And what are the implications of this campaign? And why have I joined Mayor Adams to get him over the finish line, and to sort of relaunch him, even though Adams has his own baggage? Of course, there's the issue of the anti-Semitism, and it's a weird and sort of disheartening status quo. Jews, of which I am one, and Zionists, of which I am one, we invested a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of money into sort of raising the red flag around Mamdani, that he is anti-Semitic, that he is anti-Zionistic, he's anti-Israel. And, we know no matter what he says, and no matter how much the New York Times tries to like cloak it and hide it, we know that he's all those things. I don't care what he says. He is somebody who's, if he's not anti-Semitic, he's definitely not down with the Jews, and he's definitely not down with Israel. And if you're not down with Israel, you're not down with the Jews. There's no separation. So we know he's anti-Zionistic. We know his family's anti-Zionistic. We know that he is supportive of jihadist principles. It might be a bit much to call Mamdani a jihadi, but he definitely has jihadi leanings. He's made that clear. Anybody who in any way celebrates, Hamas or October 7th, anybody who refuses to condemn the phrase globalize the Intifada, is, harbors jihadi principles. That is jihadism. So, this guy is a quasi, if not outright jihadist. And that's the guy who, we're thinking of running the most important city in the United States, and probably one of the most, if not the most important city in the whole world. So obviously that can't happen. And the issue, first around the anti-Semitism is, what's most sort of disheartening about the anti-Semitism push and focus is that it didn't really work. And in fact, worst of all, it almost seems like folks didn't really care, or it wasn't that important to people. The fact that he's, including many Jews, the fact that he harbors so many of these sentiments, and that is really, really concerning. What it says is, not only has anti-Semitism been normalized in the post-October 7th period, but it's been almost justified, it's been standardized, it's been excused, it's been sort of embedded into the mainstream culture to today in a way that no other sense of, example of discriminatory behavior would ever be tolerated. And what's so interesting about Mamdani is he knows all that. He's very, very smart. Not only is he harboring anti-Semitic and jihadi tendencies, he's very aware of it, and he knows exactly how to sort of make it work for him. I mean, I'm sure we all saw on social media the Jews for Mamdani Instagram posts. I mean, what could be more disheartening and saddening than seeing that? And what's so insidious about it to me is, nobody seems to have a problem with that. Like, would we ever see, a social media campaign of Black people supporting a campaign, a candidate that other Black people think is racist? No, that would never happen. Would we ever see, a social media campaign of, exploiting gay people to support a candidate that other gay people think is homophobic? No, that would never happen. But we do see that with Jews. So not only is it disheartening and somewhat disgusting to see these Jews participating in this and being played by Mamdani like this, but it's disheartening and disgusting to see Mamdani play these kinds of identity politics games, and if anything, I think that the fact that he is embarking on this sort of effort to use other Jews to kind of excuse his anti-Semitism is proof of the anti-Semitism. I mean, only only Jews would experience that kind of dishonor and degradation. Only Jews would have other Jews corralled and rounded up in order to and publicly put out there in order to dismiss allegations of anti-Semitism. So the fact that you even have this effort by Mamdani to, utilize Jews to counter other Jews, that is anti-Semitic, by definition, because it's a double standard. It would never happen with Blacks or any other group. So I think that there's been a real timidity and unwillingness to really dig deep and go beyond the sort of surface level simplifications of Mamdani's behavior. I think his behavior is actually more complicated and more sophisticated and more insidious. He's a really, really well versed in the world of identity politics, in intersectionality, all of the wokey buzzwords. And so much of that discourse is dependent upon the fact that people don't challenge the wokey folk and the left and the ultra progressives. Because if you challenge somebody and say, I don't agree with you, I think you're anti-Semitic, well, their retort to you is because you're the bigot. So Mamdani's really been able to successfully embrace the kind of silencing that is so endemic to woke culture. And he really, really, really knows how to speak to this demographic in a language that they're very comfortable with, and a language that really, sort of the only language they know, a language of feelings, a language of emotions, but a language very much devoid of facts and figures and data. So that's actually really scary as well. And what's really, even more scary about this election is that, we've seen city after city in the United States elect extreme ultra progressive mayors. Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco previously, especially their DA, mayors and DAs and the type. And in all of these cities, in Chicago, you have this incredible violent crime crisis. In San Francisco and LA, you have very serious issues around open air drug markets. You have really serious homeless issues. You have really serious mental problems with mental health patients. And these are in Philadelphia. You had the trank crisis, that sort of extreme opiate that everybody, that had sort of infiltrated the fentanyl drug trafficking. About a year and a half ago, called trank, and it was extremely potent and extremely dangerous. That's in Philadelphia. So in all these cities, you have really serious, extremely progressive governments, mayors, and district attorneys that have really wrought havoc on their cities. And Mamdani's even more left of these people. And New York is, even more distinctive and unique and precious in some ways than these other cities. So it's like if the far right, if the far left, they've been waiting and sort of gearing up and prepping for their moment. And boy, did they get a moment. If they get New York, it's really, this is way more than just sort of saving New York. If New York sort of tumbles to this kind of socialist, wokey, ultra left worldview, then the rest of the country is looking pretty bad as well. And we've heard that from Trump over the last few days. He's threatened to come in and deal with this young communist kid, which if it's supposed to be reassuring, it doesn't really reassure me. Mostly because I just don't want Trump having to come into New York and cleaning up some sort of quasi-communistic, defund the police, make food and buses free mayor. I don't want Trump kind of coming into New York at all. I want New York to operate autonomously as it should. So that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. Then you have Mamdani's policies, his platform, which again, like all of the things that he is suggesting on the surface, they sound kind of nifty and cool and legitimate. Why shouldn't there be, especially in a city like New York that has such an affordability crisis, where everything in New York is really about the fact that, I live in New York, I can tell you that everything here is just so insanely expensive. People cannot afford housing. They can't afford food. I mean, they can't afford transportation. Everything here is extremely expensive. And Mamdani is wise, and I think that his heart is in the right place in terms of wanting to solve these problems, but it's just not realistic. You don't sort of put rent freezes. If you put a rent freeze, then developers won't build new housing. If developers don't build new housing, you won't have them building affordable housing. And what you will have is, the current housing stock, particularly the housing stock that poor people live in, continue to degrade and degrade. And, poor people will live in worse and worse and worse environments. If you defund the police, then, in the main, if you defund the police, people like Mamdani, who are educated and wealthy and elite, will be fine. But if you defund the police, people who are minority, who are poor, who are Black and brown, they won't be fine. That's where the majority of crime in New York City happens, But you can't talk about that because it's considered racist. So Mamdani can say things like, let's defund the police, but, timid, weak-kneed, wokey reporters won't push back and say, well, won't that disproportionately impact Black and brown people because they're the ones who basically experience, 90+% of all the crime, especially violent crime in America, in New York City. I mean, again, this goes to a lot of the problem with Mamdani is that he's very, very smart in using the kind of language that we've been bamboozled in America into not pushing back against, because we're so concerned about being called racist. We're so concerned about being called, whatever. We're not concerned about being called anti-Semitic, but we're really concerned about being called racist or homophobic or any of those things. So he's been very, very clever to exploit this sort of a schism in how race and identity are dealt with in America. That's why I'm excited to go work for Adams to kind of help him push back against Mamdani and sort of say, you can't get away with this, friend. I mean, let's not forget, as we saw over the weekend, Mamdani tried to apply to college as a Black guy, and nobody, if he was white and it was found out that he had applied to Columbia as an African American, his candidacy would be over. It would have been over on Friday. And here you have the Times writing story after story, trying to equivocate and trying to say, well, it doesn't really matter, or asking if it matters. The fact that the New York Times wrote an article asking if it matters, right there is the problem. Of course it matters. And for anybody else, it would have mattered so much. They might have been sent packing. So not only do we have Mamdani really being able to tap in and activate the sort of wokey, double standard, illogical allegiances that he has with voters, he's been able to actually definitely exploit that in the media as well. And what's also interesting is that, who supports Mamdani, who doesn't support Mamdani. I mean, if you look at the people who voted for Mamdani, they were overwhelmingly white. They were overwhelmingly upper middle class, not the 1%, maybe the 5%, educated. And these are the people who Mamdani's policies are going to hurt most. I mean, these are the people who, while they may have enough money for decent housing, probably still in some ways, are worried about affording that housing. They don't want crime to rise. Interestingly enough, who didn't vote for Mamdani? Who voted for Cuomo? Well, Black people, and poorer Latins, people directly these are the folks who Mamdani is supposed to be, supporting and advocating for most aggressively, but they didn't buy it. These people saw right through him. They saw him as, an elite, out of touch, Nepo baby, which is what he is. So it's interesting to see who supports him, who doesn't support him. Obviously, there are so many communities out there that are not buying what Mamdani is selling, which means that this campaign is still very much vital. It all depends on what happens with Cuomo, and what happens with Curtis Silva, and of course, what happens with Eric Adams. I mean, the way I look at it is that we really must sort of change the narrative around this campaign. There's this feeling that Mamdani is going to win, and that's insane. That's absurd. There's no reason to think that. And if we don't change the narrative around that, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we need to change that narrative immediately. And I also think that there is this sort of misconception that this next phase of the campaign is simply a repeat of what we've had so far. And that's also not the case. What we had so far was basically, towards the end in particular, Mamdani versus Cuomo, but it's not like that anymore. We have a much wider candidate pool, and we have a much more aggressive Mayor Adams, who is the incumbent, who has the benefit of the office that he's in. Mayor Adams obviously has his own baggage, but he has also a lot going for him. So I think that it's really important that we get away from this idea and this thinking, this easy thinking that this next phase of the campaign is just a continuation of the previous phase. It's a whole new campaign, and it needs to be sort of embraced accordingly. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I have to say about Mamdani. This is a campaign with truly national implications. It should be taken very, very seriously. And anybody who is concerned about the direction of America, of urban America, should really understand that if this New York City were to, fall, for lack of a better judging term to Mamdani, yes, on many levels, the mayor of New York does have limited power, the city council, and obviously Albany, and organizations like the MTA, which we share with New Jersey. They have an incredible amount of power over what happens in New York City, but so does the mayor. Beyond just being the mayor and the gravitas that goes with it. I mean, he's the one who approves, our police commissioner, who we have with Jessica Tisch right now, who's taken a very aggressive and very clear, tough on crime stance, and we're seeing the results of that. Obviously, before she came in, crime was going down, but now we're seeing it even more. And Mamdani could, easily get rid of her and put in some, soft on crime dude or lady. And that's the last thing the city needs right now. And again, it's the last thing the city needs right now, particularly for the people who are most, affected by violent crime, which are, the minorities that Mamdani is supposed to be representing most, which he clearly doesn't. So this is really sort of what I would say the most consequential mayoral election, probably of the last 50 years in New York, if not more. And it really has national implications in a way that very rarely has a New York City election had national implications, particularly because of Trump, particularly because of Eric Adams' connections with Trump, and particularly because of Trump's strong affinity for New York City and his strong affinity for butting into New York City politics and the like.
Great. Thank you so much for that, David. That's you've done it in a very erudite and a very concise way, and there's a lot obviously to discuss here and unpack. Alex, as the local New Yorker, let me have you start us off with the first question for David before we go to the audience, and we will take it from there.
Sure. I will confess only to being a suburbanite, but I do have one child who lives in the city. So thanks very much for, as Asaf said, a very concise overview of the situation and the problems. I have lots of questions. The first one I think goes back to one of our core concerns, and one of your core concerns. Mamdani voters were, let's call them Gen X. For shorthand, as I recall, as you noted, the demography is primarily white people, many Muslims, many South and East Asians, all in a kind of, let's say, $75,000 to $150,000 income bracket.
Yeah, probably even a bit higher.
Okay. So they're voting against their self-interest to a large extent, but to what extent is his anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism bracket anti-Semitism and net positive, do you think?
And a positive,
For these voters?
well, it isn't a positive. There's nothing positive about anti-Semitism or
Well, as a
anti-Zionism.
motivating factor for these voters.
I actually think that I think what's happened is that they are now seeing the over reliance on this topic of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and perhaps are pushing back against it.
Mhm.
Either they're, super progressive wokey Jews who are saying, who want to basically say, like, they want to establish their non-alliance with Israel. They want to establish their assimilated bona fides by saying we support Mamdani. That's the proof that we are, the enlightened, progressive, assimilated, non-Zionistic Jews, and this demographic of Jews obviously, are a problem well beyond Mamdani. Mamdani is just like the tip of the iceberg about why these Jews are a problem. They're a problem when it comes to the support of Israel, the problem when it comes to the Jewish continuity in the United States, or the problem when it comes to to voting patterns. Mamdani's just been very clever in sort of like exploiting and pinpointing this schism. I mean, Ilhan Omar a couple of, last year when she was, marauding through Colombia, applauding the encampments, spoke of the genocidal Jews and the non-genocidal Jews. I mean, she walked back that, but she said it. So these folks who are talking about these Jews, in their mind, they're the non-genocidal Jews. They're the Jews who are not down on Netanyahu. They're the Jews who, when you talk about anti-Semitism, the first thing they're going to say is, what about Netanyahu? Things like that. This community is constantly trying to find a way to legitimize their lack of support for Israel. What's interesting about this group, though, is that the way I've written about it and the way I define it, either I call them sideline Jews who are staying at the sidelines because they don't want to get involved. They feel it doesn't really impact them. But really what it is that these Jews have this false sense that they are not touched by, and that they can opt out of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism won't touch them or impact them if they do A, B, or C. And voting for Mamdani, supporting Mamdani, is a great example of what they believe that they can do to opt out of anti-Semitism because they think it doesn't really impact them or is part of their lived experience. But what they will find out, going forward, if a Mamdani type is in office, is that you can't, if you're a Jew, you can't opt out of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism will find you. No Black person, I say this as somebody who's both African-American and Jewish, no Black person, no matter how successful they are, how integrated, how wealthy, how bougie, as we would say, would ever be stupid enough to think that they can opt out of racism. They know that racism is a series of factors that's way beyond them. But American Jews have this illogical thinking that if they do, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that historically Jews in America have been white and have been allowed to assimilate and have also done quite well in America, which is great, as we should have. But they have this false view that they can opt out of anti-Semitism, that it doesn't impact them. And voting for Mamdani, supporting Mamdani, is the best way that these folks can say, we're not like those other Jews. We're not worried. But you know what? When Mamdani's elected, and the bad guys come and target the Jews, they're going to target all the Jews. It doesn't work that way.
Alex, did a follow-up, or do you want to go to the audience?
Well, let's go to the audience. I have a million other questions, but I want to be fair to.
Yes, there are a bunch. All right, so David, let me try to consolidate some of these questions, and then try to include some of these things here. So there's been a lot of questions are combined between the impact of this election on national politics as far as the midterms, and also trying to assess voter turnout. As far as what we can expect to see, between the primary and the general election. Obviously, as you stated correctly, only 9.1 vote, came out. Most of the Orthodox community, and we can assume are predominantly Republican, and so we have that, factor that's going to play into all of this. but you did speak clearly about, the demographics of where they're coming from as far as young white voters, overeducated, not employed, but find this to be very trendy. So, how are you assessing all of this? And obviously, you've been traveling in the boroughs in New York and getting a sense of where people are, and what you're expecting, given his slick maneuvering and an ability to kind of feed into the younger population. When it
Yeah,
comes
so
to
I mean, I think the one thing that gives me hope, for lack of a better term, I mean, I don't want Mamdani to win. I'm going to go vote for Mayor Adams. I want Mayor Adams to win. So one thing that gives me hope, and I was asked about this right after the election, was this a vote against Cuomo or was this a vote for Mamdani? This was very much a vote for Mamdani. Mamdani's supporters came out and voted for him. They supported him. They affirmed him. They want to buy what he is selling. What's hopeful, and I don't have all the data in front of me. I'm speaking a little bit more off the cuff, but what I'm thinking is that the folks who want Mamdani to be mayor, they've already flexed their muscle. We've already seen who they are, why they're voting for him, what they want, and what their numbers are and are likely to be. What gives me some confidence or hope is that we don't know necessarily, we know who is likely to vote for Adams. We want to talk about Adams, using the exit polling from a couple of weeks ago from the primary of those voters who would likely to vote for Adams. But there's still this massive number of people who, have not been counted yet, who've not flexed their muscle. I mean, I'm an independent. I didn't vote in the primary, and I would vote for Adams. So what I'm saying is that I do think that we've already seen a large demonstration of what the support for Mamdani will look like, who they're likely to be, where they're likely to come from. Obviously, that campaign will dig down and try to expand that, but there's still this vast known unknown or unknown known pool of voters, Jews, African Americans, Latins. Then you have folks who, could be swayed from the Mamdani side if the case is made that his potential for anti-Semitism is stronger. The sort of the business class, because Mamdani will be very much not for business. So for businesses. So I think that there is still this vast known unknown of potential Mamdani voters who could really get hopefully Adams across the finish line.
Thank you. So, on that last note there, I mean, so what do you think? I mean, there's questions here about whether or not, will Curtis Sewell drop out and support Adams as far as, the potential of pushing Republicans as far as getting behind Adams. And the other point, to your last point, I think that's also critical. You started talking about the business community. I mean, there's been a lot of talk with him in the back and forth regarding individuals like Bill Ackman and Wall Street and whatnot. Those I think are strong suits that that Adams and others can make a case for as far as the financial valuability of New York. I mean, so how does that play into all this as far as what you're seeing?
So I'll go to the second part first. I mean, I think, when I was thinking about how do we get, ideally Adams across the finish line, I was interviewed by somebody, and I was like, we have to use sort of, to phrase the woke vote, we have to coalition build. Somebody asked about the Jewish question. I was saying, the Jewish question is not enough now. It really has to be coalition. We have to coalition build with folks who have shared interests in making sure Mamdani does not get across that finish line. And we're talking about, the real estate community. We're talking about, the tech community. I mean, don't forget, Mamdani wants to impose very serious, the numbers aren't so huge, but, we're a country that we don't like tax increases for anything. We don't, no matter how small it is, it's too much. So Mamdani wants to increase, corporate taxes on the top corporate earners in New York City. And right now, that's actually the tech, that's AI. New York has emerged as this massive center of massive investment in tech and AI and digital culture. That's another community that is not going to necessarily want a Mamdani in office, because they're going to have to be paying much higher taxes, which could lead them to, leave New York, set up in Florida, set up in Ireland, all these other find, crazy loopholes. So there are all of these other groups out there, real estate, all the business communities, banking, that have a very, very strong interest in making sure Mamdani does not get into office, which is why it's not surprising that if you looked at the exit poll from the primary, the actual 1%, not the 5%, but the 1%, the folks at the top, they did not vote for Mamdani. They do not want him in there. So I think that there is a lot of potential for coalition building between, unusual bedfellows, between, say, poor Black people and, rich white techies. All of them have a vested interest in making sure that Mamdani does not get into office. These interests just have to be articulated and aligned, and done so in a way that, serves all those communities. In terms of Silwa, I mean, it's tough. This is going to be, a very serious challenge, because it's not that Silwa got 5%. He got some, he got like Cuomo, he got a serious number, and it's not something to sneeze at. And also, Curtis Silwa is somebody who's been around for a very long time. He's earned his place in New York politics. We can't say that he's a dilettante. He's been doing this for a long time, and literally has put up his fists to protect the city. And I believe he's been shot, and he's been he's been physically injured to defend this city. So it's not like we can just dismiss Silwa and say, with Cuomo, for instance, you do have sort of the legitimate conceit. Hey, dude, you lost. You had a chance and you blew it. So get out, make room for somebody who can actually win. I think that's fair enough. Cuomo had his chance. He ran a terrible campaign. He's got to go. Silwa will be harder. He does have a legitimate claim to this campaign, but it's unlikely that he can win. I don't think that he really, at the end of the day, huge numbers of lower income minorities are more likely to vote for Adams than there are for Silwa. Your average kind of poor Black kid who grew up the way Adams grew up will probably vote for Adams. So Silwa doesn't have. There just isn't a compelling reason to vote for him the way there is, say, for Adams, or the way there is, say, for Mamdani, unless you're voting against Adams or against Mamdani. I think that's a way sort of brand Silwa is he's going to be kind of like a protest vote. But this is not, I'm actually taking notes in my head as I speak to you guys, but this is not a campaign where we have the luxury of protest votes. We don't have the luxury of a Bernie Sanders in 2016 situation, or anymore. Every vote will really count. Again, the good news is that, or the bad news, or the news itself is that in New York City, folks notoriously don't vote. We did a story 2 weeks ago in the Post about even someone like AOC. She won her district by a very, very small number of actual votes. A very small proportion of the people living in AOC's district actually voted for her. So the real wild card will be getting people to actually vote. And again, what keeps me encouraged is that if you look at the kinds of people that traditionally do vote, Black people, especially Black women, especially around the church, Jews, Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, they tend to vote, for folks like Eric Adams, and against folks like Mamdani.
Great, thank you for that. Alex, I see you have a question, and I'll go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'll throw out one figure that I always found very striking. That in terms of New York City's personal income tax, it's about 100,000 people pay 50% of all of the personal income tax in the city.
Yeah.
And if a meaningful percentage of those people decide to leave, as has happened in Chicago, then the city's finances have a giant hole blown in them. And now, I made the mistake of tweeting that for no particular reason. And Mamdani supporters actually jumped on me and said that would be a good thing if all these people left.
Yeah.
There's this kind of weird anti-realism
Yeah.
that motivates them, which brings me to my actual question, and that's the role of the Democratic Socialists of America, which you didn't really talk about earlier on. Mamdani is a member of this party.
Mhm.
It is explicitly socialist. It's really Communist Party light. They're very well organized, particularly
Funded.
in the city. There was an article today on CNN about them threatening to primary all sorts of New York politicians, including Hakeem Jeffries and other figures if they don't get in line. Is their extremism going to finally motivate the mainstream party, so to speak, into getting behind anybody but Mamdani, namely Adams in this case?
Yeah. So I would like to say yes. I would like to hope so. And I think it's distinctly possible. But it's very, very strong chance that it won't. Again, we're dealing with a Democratic Party that has spent, the last 20 years, if not more, obsessed with identity politics, obsessed with wokeism, obsessed with extreme progressive views. And Mamdani is, he is the logical outcome of all of that. I mean, he is, if we've been, if we can imagine an ideological concept gestating. There was a pregnancy for 20 years.
He's made in a lab.
Finally, huh?
He's made in a lab.
Yeah, I mean, the baby's born. Mamdani is it. And again, like the cornerstone of this political worldview is conformism, is silencing, is not questioning and never being allowed to question. You can't question ever anything about these woke ideologies, or else you're immediately branded as you are the problem. By questioning it, you are the problem. And the Democratic Party has been completely beholden to this. We've seen this in every major Democratic issue, whether it's DEI or critical race theory, particularly the transgender issue. They have shut themselves down. Not that they've been shut down, they have shut themselves down in any whiff of dissent. So will they rally? Will they come to their senses because of Mamdani? I want to hope so. But I'm not optimistic. I mean, the biggest celebrities in this movement, especially folks like AOC and Ilhan Omar and all these folks, I mean, they love Mamdani. And you have you layer in the Palestine issue, you layer in the Gaza issue. You layer in Mahmoud Khalil, and I think Mamdani was photographed with him and AOC the moment he came out of the detention center. You layer in Trump, right there. The fact that Mamdani was seen as sort of like a bulwark against Trump, for whom all of these people have extreme derangement. Trump is the ultimate boogeyman. There's every reason for them not to come to their senses, even though this is a moment in which they should. And I think also, since the election last year, we haven't really seen any real major examples of Democrats coming to their senses. We saw a bit of it with Gavin Newsom in California, where he launched his podcast and he was sort of dialing back some of his super extreme progressive rhetoric in order to appeal to voters, as he clearly was gearing up for a presidential run. But then you had the ICE deportation riots, protests, whatever, in LA last month, and immediately he was back, being extremely left, extreme progressive, tackling Trump. So I think the answer is probably not. I think they're just too invested, too mired, too scared. And there's a lot of money. I mean, at the end of the day, you have billionaires like George Soros pouring unlimited amounts of money into these movements, so they have no real incentive to dial back. They're going to be funded no matter what.
Right, and you have characters like Jerry Nadler and Schumer bending their knees a little bit for fear of their own careers. Dan Goldman, who's another wishy-washy individual.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether the National Party at some point steps in, but it's very hard to imagine how that would play
Right.
out.
What would that look like? Who would that be? You know, where would that come from? What's the incentive for that? You know, what are there, you know, what does that serve? How does that serve the Democratic Party? I mean, again, the Democratic Party has shown no interest in coming to their senses since Kamala's defeat last November. We've seen we've seen very few examples of it. And they've generally been examples by you know, sort of newer, whiter, Midwestern folks. There was a congressman who was elected, I think in Michigan or somewhere in the Midwest this past recently, and you know, she was taking a more centrist, you know, POV. But these are not big city Democrats. They're not urban Democrats. They're not Black Democrats or Latin Democrats. So I don't, you know, the only one we have out there kind of, you know, showing any sense is Ricky Torres. And he's also made it clear that he's perhaps, you know, hitting a pause this cycle as he figures out what's best for him.
Right. I mean, there's not enough, apropos of that point, I mean, there's not enough Richie Torreses or John Fetterman within the National as far as the Democratic Party who have not drinking the Kool-Aid. And, you know, it's all, you know, and to your point, I mean, which is, I think, really the bigger issue, all of this feeds into, you know, where the Democratic Party stands as far as everything they stand for is anti-Trump. And Mamdani is that poster child that they can jump onto and basically argue that this is, you know, he's the chalice and he's, you know, delivering the goods here, you know, of where the direction of a Democratic Party.
Right. He's the embodiment of this resistance. But again, it's very much like a straw man. I mean, it's if you actually kind of poke a bit further, you know, you know, we've begun to see that a lot of the stuff that he's sort of, you know, platforming on is a lot of hot air. I mean, it doesn't take me, you know, what more can we say? This is a man who is, you know, obsessed with identity politics, obsessed with woke culture, but he applied to college as a Black guy. I mean, nothing is more beyond the pale of identity politics than pretending to be, for someone who's not Black, to pretend to be Black, to reap the benefits of what it means to be Black in America. And yet he has in some ways gotten away with it. And I think that, you know, as what Adams is going to have to do is be much stronger and really, you know, people haven't really demanded accountability of Mamdani yet, because we haven't really seen moments where he has had to be accountable, but there's a lot there. You know, I mean, for instance, I was very curious when he was all over the gay parade in New York 2 weeks ago, or where were the questions of how do you square your Islamic identity with marching for gay rights? You know, where, like, nobody's asking Mamdani the tough questions. What we see is Mamdani like looking cute and having fun at the gay parade. So that's the news. He was there and he was, you know, glad handing. But the real question is, you know, what do his Muslim brethren think of that, or what does he think about what his Muslim brethren think about?
I think there were a few clips on Twitter of him being heckled by, let's call them right-wing Muslims at this parade. But there's also been a lot of criticism of him from very particular quarters, like within our lifetime near Dean Kiswani. Basically, you know, Islamo-communist, as well as from Unity of Fields, which is essentially Hamas in America, saying he's just a sham. He's using Gaza, Palestine, all this as a means to surf into office, and he's not really one of us. The point being that he's going to get pressure from his left, as if that's even conceivable to normal people.
Yeah, but I mean, we saw that also with, you know, the campaign of no voting in Michigan during the primary with Biden last year.
Sure.
I think the bigger, I mean, that's that. But I don't think he has this need to sort of prove himself to be more left. I think what it really comes down to is the questioning what's really beneath these policies. I mean, we're also seeing, you know, a lot of Indian Americans who are unhappy with the fact that he has made, you know, really, really aggressive allegations against, you know, Hindus in India. He claimed
he wants to arrest Narendra Modi when he comes to New York.
Right. He also claimed that there were no more Muslims in Gujarat following, riots between Muslims and Hindus some 15 years ago, and they were all, exterminated. And lots of Indians from Gujarat are saying, no, there are 7 million Muslims in Gujarat, and they're doing just fine. Again, where is the question about where is the accountability? If this was a question that tied to, say, Gaza or to Israel, they would be all over it. But Mamdani also, what's interesting about him is that he is he's a real first of his kind. I mean, we haven't really had a person like him, and there's a sophistication, even though he himself, who knows how truly sophisticated he is, his candidacy, his existence, his intersectionality, his multiculturalism, his cosmopolitanism. It's a very sophisticated way of existing in the world that lots of folks in America, particularly the media, are just not really experienced with in dealing with. I mean, we saw it somewhat with Kamala because she had a kind of a complicated backstory, and with her, again, folks were really sort of timid about asking tough questions. Mamdani is even more complicated. He comes from Uganda of all places. Where's that? His mom's a filmmaker, but makes kind of like artsy Indian themed films. So he has a very his presence he's complicated. He's a complicated, complex entity, and it requires a real level of sophistication in engaging that I think that he's got. I mean, that's why he's gotten away with a lot so far, is that folks literally didn't have a script to read off of in order to engage with him.
Well, on that point, I have yet to see any media, maybe outside the Post, in the New York area or beyond, be able to address the issue of, well, AOC actually grew up in Yorktown Heights and was called Sandy when she lived there. But no, she's a 100% daughter of the Bronx.
Yeah.
And this very simple kind of disparity in the factual record, which is overwhelmed by a not a hugely compelling narrative behind her. She's not a terribly complex individual or articulate individual. So if they can't deal with her, it's hard to imagine them dealing with a cosmopolitanite like Mamdani, or wanting to.
And I think that is what he is counting on. I mean, even if he doesn't even articulate it, he understands that, I mean, I can say this because I sort of see it in my own experience. I'm somebody who's, I'm African-American, I'm also Jewish, I'm also LGBT, like I'm a lot of things. And people have a hard time, engaging with me and knowing how to speak to me and worrying that they're going to offend me and not necessarily, and concerned about, intent and boundaries and I'm not like Mamdani. I'm sort of like, ask me what you want. If you ask me with a smile, I'm fine. You know what I mean? But I know from my own personal experience how much power there is, this perception that you are not allowed to talk to somebody like me in a certain way. There's a lot of power in the implication of what you're not allowed to do because I look a certain way or because I have a certain kind of partner. And Mamdani is, even if I don't even know if he fully even realizes it, but he's been able to really tap into this unwillingness or this lack of permission to really, by this culture, by the far left, by progressive culture, of which the New York Times and the Guardian are like, the Bibles, their unwillingness, their fear, because these media organizations are ultimately run and controlled by 25-year-old social media managers who they're who are on Twitter, because the leadership of these publications are basically terrified by their own 20-something-year-old Twitter employees So Mamdani is really benefiting from an unwillingness or a lack of sophistication in how to speak to him. But it's there, you know what I mean? Like, there are plenty of ways to engage with Mamdani in the language that he needs to be engaged with in order to answer the tough questions. That just hasn't happened yet, but it will.
So let me ask you on that note, and I know we're running short on time, but to that last point, that was exactly the question that that Hakeem Jeffries tried to ask him when it comes to him cracking down on anti-Semitism. How does he square the circle when it comes to the issue of the Jewish population in New York and distinguishing and making the distinction when it comes to Israel and being Jewish in New York? And obviously it feeds into the larger narrative that he's been trying to, the kind of genocidal Jews versus the non-genocidal Jews, that you made that distinction clearly. But when presumably he understands that some Jews do see Israel as part of their identity, and especially in the New York area. And how does he address or see anti-Semitism as a feature of racism, discrimination that he claims to be fighting?
I mean, again, it needs to be demanded of him. It hasn't been demanded of him. I'll give you a perfect example. Like, he was on Good Day New York, and he was talking about how he supports Israel as a sovereign nation, but not a Jewish nation, because he doesn't support sort of ethnocratic states. This was the same states that privilege, one ethnicity over the other. This was the same thinking that his mom used, actually, in 2013 when she was invited to the Haifa Film Festival. And it was the same thinking that Ta-Nehisi Coates used when he was questioned last year during his whole Evil book tour. What these people conveniently forget is that there are like 20-something officially Islamic countries all over Israel that that basically discriminate against non-Muslims far more than Israel discriminates against non-Jews, but nobody pushes back and nobody asks. So I think, again, like, the problem isn't Mamdani. The problem is a media and an ecosystem that hasn't been prepared and has been bamboozled into basically constantly going soft on him because they're afraid of being, called racist or being canceled or whatever. And that's what needs to change. Like, he's performing, he's executing in a way that he's clearly been able to get away with, and that served him. The task for everybody else is to say, this is no longer going to be acceptable. I mean, when you talk about the anti-Semitism issue, for instance, if there's sort of a running narrative within sort of progressive woke culture. If a Black person says that they've experienced racism, they believe something's to be racist, then you must believe them. And you believe all women, for instance, in case of sexual assault. All these various progressive totems, you believe the victim. Only Jews are the ones who are questioning as to whether it's actually true. Well, that needs to be pushed back against Mamdani. He is anti-Semitic because Jews believe that he is anti-Semitic. And that belief is as real and valid and legitimate to them as any Black person who might claim that they believe in racism. And that's how I would push back against Mamdani. That's how I would frame it. I would use the language of the ecosystem in which he already exists against him.
Great. David, I know our time is short, and you've unpacked a lot for us, and obviously there's a lot more to discuss. So for starters, and again, we wish you the best of luck in the new role and success, of course. There is maybe one last question here. People are asking those of the audience who are living in the New York area, how can they help out? So maybe you want to say one last word about that. And your efforts, but I do want to thank you for taking the time, and Alex, as always, for joining me, and I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah, I mean, you can support Mayor Adams. He's the only one that's truly electable to get Mamdani, make sure he doesn't win. And no matter who you support, I hope you support Mayor Adams, but make your opposition to Mamdani known. This is the key thing. There's a perception that everybody loves him. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy that will get him into office. If you are not supporting Mamdani, make that known. People need to see that he's not fait accompli, and that his candidacy is very much up for grabs.
Great. Well, thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Hoping everybody has a good day. And David, I'm sure we will talk soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very much.